The Dolphins play their final preseason contest tonight in Tampa Bay. What am I watching? Glad you asked. We're going over that here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami, and the NFL Draft Lead over at the 33rd Team. You can find all of our shows here on the Locked On Network on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. The Dolphins' final preseason contest. We're about to put a bow on this thing. Training camp wrapped with the joint practices. Now we have a final preseason contest, and then we're playing for keeps. And there's a lot to watch for a third preseason game. There's a lot on the line for guys. Case in point, I did the 53-man roster projection yesterday, cut double-digit guys I didn't want to cut. And that didn't include the other member of the QB2 battle in Skylar Thompson. That didn't include a number of other players, running backs, Jeff Wilson. That didn't include Nick Needham. There's a lot of guys here that have something to play for. When you add it all up, looking at the depth chart, you probably have 6 to 8 open spots. And the team probably has a pretty good idea of who's going to occupy those spots. It's not like you're going to go in and say, all right, best 8 performances in the week 3 preseason game are going to get the 8 spots, right? And there's some strategy involved as far as how you prioritize guys you think maybe you can keep on the practice squad, don't make the cut because you know you can put them on the practice squad and then you can elevate them throughout the course of the season versus players with maybe longer term contracts and multi-year control. If that's important to you, there's a lot. But you probably have 15 to 18 guys playing for 6 spots, 8 spots at best. So what are you watching? Like, where do your eyes go in a game like this? The first thing that I want to know is who plays and when. You think about the QB2 competition. If Mike White doesn't start the game tonight, that tells me they're either trying to get Skylar Thompson to take the job or they believe that Skylar Thompson has the job. One or the other. But given the way that the first 2 preseason games have played, for Mike White coming in late in the second half of these games and not really having a lot to work with what's around him, they either feel really confident in knowing what Mike White is and they're really trying to figure out what Skylar Thompson is, or they've already decided Skylar Thompson's a QB2. So from if you don't get an assessment of Mike White with the guys that Skylar's been playing with, I think that's very telling. What it tells you, we'll find out when they do the cuts. But it's one of the things that I'm absolutely watching. Along the offensive line, who plays? Does Liam Eichenberg play? Does Robert Jones play? Does Jack Driscoll start? Mike McDaniel alluded to there being jobs out there to be won. And some guys may be needing reps to build their resume for what they're capable of with players alongside them. If it were me, if you're a starter or if you're in the competition for a starter in the third preseason game, I don't think you touch the field. The Dolphins have already lost 2 potentially rosterable offensive linemen in Sean Harlow and Keon Smith for the season with season-ending injuries, one in each of the first 2 preseason games. I don't want to take another hit to another guy that I think could make this roster as an offensive lineman. So my starting offensive line would probably be Patrick Paul and Ryan Hayes at tackles, and they'd probably go the distance. And then I'd probably have Jack Driscoll and Lester Cotton and Andrew Meyer as the guards. And then as this game plays out, Matthew Jones and Chasen Hines can come in. If you want to move Ryan Hayes around, great. If you want to give Bayron Matos some opportunities and take Patrick Paul out at some point to play it safe with him, cool. If somebody higher up in the pecking order plays, I think that would be meaningful. And I already think it's mean if Jack Driscoll doesn't play, I think that's meaningful too. So who plays, I think you can try to extrapolate as best as you can based on what decisions are made on who gets what looks. But it will be very telling for who dresses, particularly along the offensive line. Defensively, I want the young guys getting in the mix. I want to continue to see these UDFAs and late round draft picks. Muhammad Kamar got a lot of run and a lot of snaps. I'd probably handle the early guys up on the depth chart, kind of like he did the first preseason game. I'm assuming Ethan Bonner was back at practice. Is that worth it? Or do you just roll with Nick Needham and Saran Neal to start the game and then get into Storm Duck and Isaiah Johnson, which is probably what I would do at that spot. The challenge with that is if you're trying to sneak one of those guys through in the practice squad and they keep getting good reps on tape, their bigger body of work is not going to help you to accomplish that. As I consider linebackers, this is a big game for Channing Tindall. How early does Channing Tindall get out there? Because Curtis Bolton's been ahead of him. And Curtis Bolton got here 2 weeks ago. I'd let a guy like that go the distance. And if Cam Smith hadn't had the hamstring issue pop back up, that's a guy I probably would have let play the whole first half. Guys that need reps. Ezukama got banged up against Tampa after a really good day of practice. Was it against Tampa or was it against them, or was it the practice before? Either way, is he good to go? Can we tape him up and he goes out and plays? If he does, I'd let him play the whole game. Who they choose to put out there for this contest and choose to evaluate and put in situations, I think will tell us a lot. What it actually tells you, though, you're going to have to wait until the cuts to interpret what they told you with who dresses and who doesn't. Guys on the bubble, I want to go a little bit deeper into who's on the bubble. Guys I think can actually make some needle-moving momentum in this game against Tampa Bay. That's going to come your way next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you stick with us as we preview the preseason contest against Tampa Bay. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. When your schedule is packed with so much, kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. But what are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day. Perhaps you should not skip therapy day. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for everything that you need to. When you feel like you have no time for yourself, the non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule, and it's entirely online. You can fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. As far as guys on the bubble who I think can really make some momentum, I think this entire group of interior defensive linemen is so closely bunched that I do think a strong performance in a game like tonight can go a long way in helping you to lock up a spot. No, I think a lot of the other spots, whether you consider the skill group as a whole, right? Running back, I think the top three are pretty consolidate or pretty solid, and then you got a fullback in there. It's, do you carry a fourth running back versus a sixth wide receiver versus a fourth tight end? Like you got to put all those guys in the same bucket competing for presumably the same one or two roster spots. So that's Chris Brooks and Jeff Wilson. Jeff Wilson had a nose injury, but his body of work is one that I think fairly speaks for itself. I don't think he's necessarily somebody you need to go out there and have play. It's just the question of the floor and the ceiling versus Jeff versus the floor and the ceiling and the cost of Chris Brooks versus the floor and the ceiling and the cost of Eric Ezukama and the long-term control of those players versus Jeff Wilson in a contract year. Like, all of that goes into that individual decision with, I don't want to say a flex, right? It's not like fantasy football, but really you have your players that you know are going to be represented on the roster. And it's like, okay, with the margins that we have with the handful of spots, how many do we want to give to the skill group versus the offensive line versus the interior defensive line? And that's, I think, what makes the interior defensive line group so fascinating to me is they're all right there. I mean, Isaiah Mack has made nice plays. Deshaun Hand has made nice plays. Neville Gallimore has made nice plays. Brandon Peely has made nice plays. Jonathan Harris has been a pretty consistent player. So what do you want? What skills do you want to have depth in? Because I think between Benito Jones, Calais Campbell, Zach Sealer, you have guys that can do, at least Campbell and Sealer are pretty diverse talents. Do you want another nose tackle player on the roster? If they do, then yeah, they'll presumably keep Brandon Peely after they cut Tier Tart. I think that is potentially a good vote of confidence for Brandon Peely that they did cut Tier Tart, or alternatively, it's an acknowledgement that we're only going to have one of this skill group and Benito Jones has won the job. And again, you're going to have to wait until the cuts actually happen to fully and correctly interpret what they're trying to tell you. But at least in the meantime, you can read between the lines and understand the potential forks in the road that each one of the Dolphins' personnel decisions and decisions for tonight's game will tell you about these individual players. I want to touch on Nick Needham, who I think would be somebody that would get claimed or signed elsewhere if he didn't make the team. But he's a player I really struggle with because Nick Needham's not been bad in any capacity, right? You consider nickel and safety and special teams. He's experienced doing all of those things. But if you put Nick Needham in the hierarchy of either the corner or the safety room, or even like your designated specialists, how high does he rank? That's where I have the biggest issue with a guy on the bubble like Nick Needham, who, in total fairness to Nick Needham, has had a pretty solid camp from start to finish. But if you put him in safety, he's not ahead of Jordan Poyer, Javon Holland, and he's certainly not ahead of Marcus May, the way Marcus May's played, especially this past week against Washington. Made a ton of plays. 10-year vet, very experienced, third safety type. I think gives you a much higher floor as a third safety than what you would have with Elijah Campbell or Nick Needham. So I feel like those three are comfortably ahead of him. Then you look at Elijah Campbell. Who's a better player? Elijah's a little bit more dynamic. Elijah's a better special teams player for my money on kick coverage units. And Elijah Campbell's been getting run with, at times, the first team at safety in front of Marcus May. So he's at best safety 5. And this doesn't even get into Patrick McMorris as another not dynamic athlete with good instincts, like Nick Needham has proven himself to be through his first 5 years in the NFL. So I can't find a pathway for him at safety. And you look at corner. Okay, you got, again, a bunch of guys that can fill a bunch of spots. So that muddies the water of saying, like, oh, well, he's the backup nickel. You got to keep him. I don't think so, because Jalen Ramsey can play the nickel. Kader Kohu can play the nickel. Kendall Fuller can play the nickel. Your safeties can drop down and play in the nickel. Cam Smith's capable of playing the nickel when he's healthy. If you want to get into a debate about the reliability of Cam Smith at this point with the soft tissue stuff, I'd say, okay, yeah, it's been a rough year for him in that regard. A rough start to the year. The years hasn't even really started yet. Rough camp for him in that regard. And then you get into the special teams guy in Saron Neal, like Elijah Campbell, who I think is in front of him because of the special teams value that he brings. He's an absolute dog on teams. And then you got Ethan Bonner, who's got all these physical tools, is a younger player, is more dynamic, is one of the fastest players on the team. So he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. CB7? You keeping 7 CBs or 5 safeties? I don't think you are. So it's a tough spot for a player like Nick, who, again, has been solid. And this doesn't even get into the UDFA corners, which I think are really fascinating, and I would probably prioritize over Nick for their potential ceiling, whether that's any of the three. Maitre is a nickel player, or Jalen Johnson, or Isaiah Johnson, or Storm Duck. It's tough numbers. So I was actually surprised that Albert Breer was at joint practices for SI, and one of the things, like the takeaway for him was, don't be surprised if the Dolphins claim a corner or two. I don't think so. I think that group's pretty solid, and it's deep, because a guy like Nick Needham is going to have a 53 home somewhere, but he's no better than your CB7 in my eyes, in my evaluation. He's no better than safety 5. That's a tough bubble guy to be, especially because the guy has realistically done about everything he can, short of making interceptions every day in practice. He's been solid. So the other thing, and I didn't really account for this in the 53-man roster show that we did yesterday, but you see some of this across the league. Because of the practice squad elevation dynamics, you do see some teams that prioritize not just like authentically who are your best players, just keep your best players, which feels like common sense anyway, but they don't prioritize low-value positions. You see some teams carry 2 linebackers on a 53. The Dolphins last year carried 2 tight ends on the 53, right? Those are traditionally low positional value, with air quotes, positions, even though I think linebackers have become one of the most important groups for modern defenses because of all of the things that they have to do to bridge your fronts and your coverage shells. But you see teams that carry numbers either too much or too little of certain positions, and you look at it and you say, well, that's not sustainable. But they have guys that don't dress on game day, and they bring guys up off the practice squad as a result because they can. And it's their way to kind of get through the initial heat of waiver claims and keep the players that they want to keep, and then try to manipulate and carry guys into the first month of the season. And then you try to push them out onto the practice squad because everybody else had other answers elsewhere on their teams. So I didn't really do that. But in some of these groups, whether that is the defensive line, or whether that is corner, or whether that is probably not tight end, maybe wide receiver, maybe you could keep 7. Could you activate Odell and keep Odell, Tyreek, Jalen Waddle, Ezu Kanma, Braxton Berrios, Malik Washington, River Craycraft, but Craycraft's probably going to go on IR anyway, so probably not. The secondary is probably the spot that it would happen, or the defensive front, where you're like, wow, they kept that many. Maybe they do keep Nick Needham, and they keep a disproportionate amount and wait the first month of the season and then try to push somebody through the practice squad. There's so many different ways that you could do it, and that's why I love the team building aspect of all of this, and that's why we do Locked On NFL Scouting, myself and Joe Marino. Now, we're going to get into, there was a story that was run or on Dolphins Wire that I enjoyed. I thought it was good. We're going to give it a little bit of a shout out and react to some of the names that were included in it as we get ready for the final major churn of the roster for the start of the 2024 NFL season. That's next. Stick with us. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In any given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking in LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong places. LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses report getting a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. So the story comes from Adam Stites. 5 hypothetical trades for the Dolphins before the regular season. Thought this was fun. Some interesting names here. I thought this was well done as far as the names that were picked. So shout out Adam Stites. We're going to cover it here on the show. And this ran on Wednesday afternoon. Less than a week, Dolphins 31 of the teams will trim their rosters from 90 to 53, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here are 5 hypothetical trades for the Dolphins, and I'm going to give you my smasher pass on each potential trade hypothetical that Adam puts out here. Dolphins trade Taylor Heineke to the Dolphins. I would probably pass on this. And Heineke, if you remember, was the quarterback that I had targeted to be the backup quarterback for the 2023, not 2024, but 2023 offseason blueprint, which is where in the beginning of March, I do a full mock offseason with free agency, the draft, salary cap, player contract extensions, all that jazz. 53-man roster projection, 3-year salary cap outlook for the next 3 seasons. Heineke, I had targeted as like, hey, I'd really like what this player brings to the table. He's a more experienced version of the kind of player that Skylar Thompson is. I think he's better than Skylar Thompson. But I also have a hard time shaking watching Taylor Heineke in the preseason contest against Miami. The Dolphins got an up-close and in-person look at Heineke in that contest. And it's funny, this phenomena that happens across the league. If you perform really well against teams like Jahan Dotson did against the Philadelphia Eagles last year, teams are usually going to go out of their way to try to go find that player and add that player to the mix because they are uniquely aware of what that player is capable of because that player hurt them last time they did it. Odell Beckham against Miami last year had the phenomenal catch down the field when playing for the Baltimore Ravens. Aaron Brewer, I think one of the better games that he played last year was against the Dolphins, and pass protection against Christian Wilkins was really strong performance. Let's see. Is there anybody else? Kendall Fuller doesn't really count because Washington's defense as a whole at that point was a disaster. Braxton Berrios had done some nice things with the Jets, but that was there was a little bit of separation there. But you could definitely point to at least Aaron Brewer and Odell Beckham, and those guys had good performances. And then the Eagles just traded a 3rd-round pick and 2 7s for Jahan Dotson and a 5 to bring him into the fray for Philadelphia. So the Dolphins seeing Heineke in the preseason this year, I don't think would help this case for that to happen. And I don't know that it's enough of a needle move over Mike White / Skylar Thompson, I suppose. They're still both in this battle together. That I would invest an extra asset to go get him as a player. I don't think he gives you anything other than just another option that's in the same bucket than what you currently have, and I don't want to give assets away for that. As far as this one, Dolphins trade Jeff Wilson to the Cowboys. I kind of dig this one. Now, you wouldn't get more than probably like a future 7 because Jeff Wilson's in a contract year, but Dallas's running backs are Ezekiel Elliott, Rico Dowdle, and Royce Freeman are the top 3 on the depth chart. You mean to tell me Jeff Wilson wouldn't be a nice add to this backfield if the Dolphins are indeed going to move on from him and either keep Chris Brooks or keep 3 running backs and then put somebody on the practice squad and put that guy up for game day if one of the 3 guys gets banged up? You mean to tell me that wouldn't happen? I would really like that for Miami while understanding running back in a contract year that's not making the minimum salary is not going to be anything you get anything substantial for. But at that point, nothing is worse than something. So I'd be interested if Dallas was interested in making that transition. Texans trade John Mechie III to the Dolphins. I dig this one a lot. Mechie's had a rough stretch to start his career after he got drafted by the Texans and he got diagnosed with leukemia and had to spend his whole first year away from the team and get treatment and get healthy. And thankfully, he is healthy. He was recovered and able to come back and play football. but there's a pre-existing chemistry that exists with John Mechie, who played at ... Alabama. So if the Dolphins are sitting here and they're going to say, well, Odell potentially on PUP, and say hypothetically he's not ready for the start of the season. Well, River Craycraft's going to have to go on IR. And Eric Ezukanma is banged up again. Like if you get that deep and you're the Dolphins and you're looking at it's Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill, it's Braxton Berrios, it's Malik Washington, and potentially Eric Ezukanma, but Ezukama's banged up. Like, yeah, you'll probably need to bring somebody in that you feel good about. And while Mechie doesn't necessarily have experience in the system, the Slowick Houston branch is off the Shanahan tree and uses some familiar terminology. And there's a pre-existing chemistry with Mechie as a player playing at Alabama. I'd be interested in that one. That's probably a late round pick swap as well. So why don't we take Jeff and trade him to Dallas and then trade that pick and send that to Houston for Mechie, and then you do an indirect three-way player swap kind of deal. I really like the idea of John Mechie. Jackson Carman is the next one that Adam brought to the table. And I'd probably pass on Jackson Carman. Played at Clemson, second-round pick in 2021. Started during his rookie season, hasn't played since. The Bengals' offensive line is one that has had a lot of work done to it in the same vein as what the Dolphins have had with theirs. It's kind of the same thing as Taylor Heineke for me, where I feel like a player of that caliber, I don't think has a ceiling that puts you into a different stratosphere than what you have. And, oh, by the way, he hasn't played in the system. And they've been very clear in their messaging that guys that are in the system for longer fundamentally understand it better and therefore execute it better. And that in turn should help draw out their physical ability even more. So if you're going to go get an offensive lineman, I would like an offensive lineman that is well-versed in Shanahan wide zone. Now, there's some West Coast offense stuff that overlaps, but the wide zone elements, I don't think Carmen's a great fit for. The last one, Raiders trade defensive end / edge Tyree Wilson to the Dolphins. This is kind of piggybacking off of the report, according to Adam, with his story that the Dolphins had made a call about Matt Judon. Tyree Wilson was a former top 10 pick with the Raiders and has not done much, did not do much in his rookie season. Still looks to be struggling a little bit in the preseason. So I can see the vision here. There's two ways my brain goes with this one. I see the vision for a Baltimore style scheme and what Calais Campbell is and what I think Tyree Wilson can be when he's at his best. And Miami potentially getting an opportunity to buy cheap on that with that talent feels like a very Chris Greer thing to do. Am I going to invest an asset and a draft pick? If I were going to have done this, I probably would not have committed to Emmanuel Agba. And I understand that the Shaq Barrett retirement kind of puts you in a bind where you had to make a decision fast because you were going into training camp and Chubb and Phillips weren't available to you. So I get it. I get why that decision was made. I think this is a good idea with maybe bad timing. Right place, wrong time type of hypothetical. So I'm really in and buying on two. If you told me the Dolphins traded for John Mechie with a late day 3 pick, great, I'm in. If you told me the Dolphins traded Jeff Wilson and got something for a player who is in a contract year and you're probably going to move on from, great, I'm in. So job well done by Adam on this story. I really enjoyed the 5 names he brought and the arguments for them. But that is going to do it for us here on the pregame Locked On Dolphins ahead of preseason game number 3 against Tampa Bay. Listen, I do have some travel tonight, So I'm going to be a little later than normal on my reaction show. You're still going to get a postcast from Greece over on Locked On Sports Miami. And that'll show up in the Locked On Dolphins YouTube feed or Locked On Dolphins podcast feed. But please know you're not going to see mine immediately after the game. So give me a little bit of time to get my travel stuff done tonight. And then I will get back with you guys again this weekend to react to the preseason game between the Dolphins and the Bucs. So you have lots of content to look forward to as we churn towards the end of the preseason and the start of the regular season. I'm Kyle Krabs. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. Find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Appreciate you guys for checking out the show. Go Fins.